All right. Hello, everybody. This is the Clatsop County DSA's first live public event. We have Seth Tichenor here to kind of give us an overview of what socialism means in today's modern society. Just so you're all warned, this is being recorded so that we can publish it and let people that maybe didn't make it see the talk. Let's see, in a month, we're going to be having another event on January 10th at 6 p.m. called Politics and Organizing After Trump. So please, if you can, try to RSVP for that. And Seth, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. As Luca said, I'm Seth Tichenor, and I teach philosophy, religion, politics up at the college, Clatsop Community College, amongst other things. I was asked to give a talk tonight about socialism generally, kind of a bird's eye view of what socialism is. And this is I have to tell you, this is a little bit of a daunting task in some ways, because it is such a broad topic. It goes in so many different directions. And you know, as you look through and sort of try to figure out some ways to approach this, you read some of these surveys of this stuff, and there's these great arcane languages that are spoken about, 100 years ago, these surveys of socialism, saying that there are many mansions in the house of socialism, essentially saying that there's this huge diversity of ways in which socialism can understand itself, the way in which it defines itself, the way in which it manifests, and the way in which it works out. And this, in fact, is probably part of the reason why the term socialist is something that can be used as this sort of vague insult on the political right, particularly in the United States, but across the world, because there probably is some aspect of something that called itself socialist at one time or another that does what they're accusing socialism of doing. But that said, as much as there's this broad array of ways in which socialism works, I think there are certain, I guess you might call them family traits that socialism has, no matter how, whether it's a democratic socialism or it's a more revolutionary form of socialism, like some of the various forms of Marxism or something else. There's certain qualities that they tend to have in common. And I think a good way to sort of go through this would be to, as far as getting a sense of what this is to look at sort of two sides of this. The political economy, the way in which socialism in general approaches the application of economy and the politics that it uses to make that application, use that on one side. And then on the other side, talk about the political ideology, and even more than that, the critiques of ideology that socialism often has with this. So the political economy, the ideology, I want to sort of go through and mark out some general features of that as we go through this. As far as the political economy goes, well, like I said, we have got a broad swath here. Democratic socialism and the more authoritarian forms of socialism that you see, Marxism, Maoism, what you see in North Korea, or the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea, as it calls itself, can be very different with this. But there are a few things that are common. First, there is, within all socialism, there is the notion that there needs to be and ought to be, for a functioning economy, public ownership of the means of production, right? Public ownership of the means of production. That is to say that the things that a society needs in order to sustain itself, in order to operate, in order to be productive, need to be held in a public good for the common public good, right? Public trust for the public good. Things like utility, education, medicine, housing, transportation, the things that make it possible for a society to work the socialist will say this fundamentally is what ought to be held by socialism, right? So there is property in socialism, even in the more radical forms of socialism. Property does still exist, properly speaking, but it exists to one degree or another in a way that is owned by or controlled by the central by the government. Now, this is something that also means that socialism is going to be is something that's probably better understood as a matter of degree, as something that is not so much you are a socialist or you aren't a socialist, or a nation is socialist or isn't socialist, but rather the degree to which it applies socialist policies and practices and ultimately ideologies. I mean, after all, the United States has social security. That's essentially a socialist policy, right? We have public education, K through 12. It's hardly equal, and it's not. And there are plenty of attempts to try to destabilize it, but particularly under Betsy DeVos, who's on her way out. But nonetheless, it continues to exist. We have Medicare, we have Medicaid. These are socialist policies, or at least they're policies that are informed by the principle of socialism. So even a country like the United States, which hardly would call itself a socialist country, has socialist dimensions at work within it, right? And at the same time, if you were to look at some place that is quite socialist and explicitly socialist to the point of being really Marxist, say Cuba, the Cuban government has and really has always allowed for certain small market activities, sort of private affairs, to go one way or another. So to say that they are purely socialist would be a mistake. Point of all this being that socialism, if understanding socialism in terms of the way in which it applies within a society, really is something that's better understood in a matter of degree, right? Rather than just being one thing or another, because it has to do with the general approach to the application of it. A third feature, I guess, that I would say of the political economy that marks socialist thought is that economic policies are understood in a way that is rather distinct from what you see in capitalist political economies, in that they are understood in terms of distribution rather than acquisition. Now, what I mean by this is thinking a little more deeply about what the nature of wealth itself is and what it means to have wealth in a society. If you have a tremendous amount of wealth, but that tremendous amount of wealth is concentrated at a particular point within that society, there is a way in which wealth is not doing what it needs to do. I mean, in the same way that wealth acts a little like lifeblood to a body politic, when it's all distributed in one particular point or a few particular points, it's not very capable of doing the things that wealth is supposed to do. And as a consequence of this, one of the things that socialism will lift up is to say that if wealth is finding concentration in specific places, that wealth is actually not acting like wealth. In order for wealth to truly be wealth, it has to be distributed throughout society, and it has to be distributed really towards a kind of equality, or at least a kind of equanimity, a way of lifting those up according to where they need to be with this, right? And that kind of brings me to the final point that comes up within socialism, is a phrase that really comes out of the 19th century. It was something that was, it actually is a pre-Marxist phrase. It's from the early 19th century, although Marx agreed with it and then elaborated on it. And it was each according to their contribution. That is to say that compensation within the political economy of a socialist system should be organized by giving to each according to their contribution, and specifically to their contribution to the whole output of society. This is held in distinction to the capitalist approach to this, from a socialist point of view, which looks at ownership of production rather than the actual productivity that's being done. There is an illusion, the socialist says, that occurs within capitalist societies, and I'll say more about this in a second, but it's that productivity has to do with those who own the means of production. Well, the problem with that is quite often those who own the means of production do a great many things that aren't especially productive. Indeed, they do a whole bunch of things that are counterproductive in order to make themselves enriched within a capitalist system. Socialism says this is something that must be addressed, suppressed, and corrected. And in the way that you do that is by looking at what is done and how that's distributed, how it's helping for the overall betterment of society and rewarding accordingly to that. The idea with this, though, and this is something that comes explicitly from Marx, but it ends up getting brought up in, I won't say every form of socialism that I'm familiar with, but certainly within a good deal of them. This phrase of each according to their contribution is meant to evolve into each according to their need. From each according to their contribution to the whole of society, to each according to their need. The idea being that as society evolves within a socialist milieu, as the ideals and limits and structures and institutions that break us apart, that put us in competition with one another, that force us to be competitive with one another in order to make wealth into a zero-sum game, as those things break down, the idea of wealth within a society, and I don't just mean wealth, I mean well-being wealth, I mean food, I mean happiness, I mean health, I mean all of these things, that those are then brought to a place where they can be distributed according to who needs it. And by virtue of that, wealth can sort of reach a fruition. Wealth can truly act like wealth, as opposed to some instrument by which we maneuver to hopefully acquire wealth someday, the way a capitalist system, or even earlier than that, a feudal system would deal with it. So these points of public ownership of the means of production, a variation in the way in which you apply it in a matter of degree, a lifting up of distribution over acquisition, and each according to their contribution to the whole of society. These would be the four sort of general themes, I would say, are part of the policies of political economy within a socialist government or a socialist society. And this brings us over to the other side of this that I wanted to mention, the idea of ideology. Now, socialist ideology is probably even trickier to approach than the political economy, because it's probably even more diverse in many ways. But if I had to lift out a few things in sort of the broad strokes that we would do here, I would say this. The first thing I would say is that socialist political ideology holds that public ownership remedies the social ills and becomes that we find ourselves facing, and becomes an avenue for justice, right? So public ownership becomes a way of watering down or dissolving at least many social ills that exist, and by virtue of that becomes an avenue for justice. How and why does it do that? Well, so much, remember, from the point of view of a socialist, capitalism is a way of producing wealth that ends up having a peculiar flaw to it. And that is, whatever wealth is produced is always wealth that is produced at the expense of someone else. It's required that there be these inequities in terms of the way in which it understands wealth. Capitalism understands wealth. And from these inequities come all sorts of social problems. This is what breaks down families. This is what causes poverty and all the problems that come with poverty: drug addiction, depression, mental illnesses, all sorts of crime, right? These things come from this. If you could dissolve not just each of those specific problems, but the font that seems to give rise to that, you would probably be able to address a lot of these problems because they wouldn't have nearly the power that they seem to have otherwise. And one of the ways to do that, one of the central ways to do that from a socialist point of view, is to put the means of production to one degree or another in a more centralized and planned situation, right? I mean, just to think about it in terms of the wealth that we have in this country, think about how there are a lot of things that could have gone a lot better with regard to the way in which we have approached COVID-19 and the economic crises that have come from this, and as well as the public health crises. But if people were not living paycheck to paycheck, if people were not in a position where there was no safety net for them other than the occasional stimulus checks that they get and the generous but limited unemployment that they were receiving, if there was actually structures here that were organized in order to handle this, to make sure that people didn't lose their houses, that people didn't have to be foreclosed upon, that businesses didn't have to be evicted or go into bankruptcy, think about how much more smoothly this would go. And you could say, well, that would be awfully expensive. Well, yeah, the path we're on is already expensive. And I think in a country in which the wealthiest man in it has control of $129 billion, not million, billion. That is to say, you could take $120 billion from him and he would still be a billionaire many times over in terms of his wealth. I think we probably have some access to that kind of wealth. This is what socialism would say with this. Secondly, more in terms of the critique mode and going into this critique mode, socialism holds that the previous means of production, and in particular here, capitalism, are dysfunctional. And they're dysfunctional, big news there, but they're dysfunctional in the sense that they are laced with contradictions. They are laced with contradictions that undermine the capacity to realize and manifest their purported values. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in this case, I'm trying to talk about the idea of things that we come to take for granted within capitalism as simply the rise and fall, the ebb and flow of the marketplace, and yet they're qualities that if they were left untended, or even when they're lifted up as a way of producing wealth, they undermine themselves. They contradict their capacity to be able to do these things. I'm thinking of things like inefficiencies within systems, built-in obsolescences within products, right? That are done specifically with the idea of raising profits, despite the fact it ends up making the product less effective, right? Something like this. Or the capacity, and even for that matter, really the necessity of monopolies. And the idea that a monopoly, whether or not it fits the legal definition of a monopoly or simply is de facto a monopoly, is seen as a form of progress. Now, one of the arguments that comes up with these sorts of things is to say, oh, well, you're all against monopolies, and yet you socialist are the one who's talking about controlling the means of production in a centralized state. That's the monopoly par excellence, isn't it? It is, except that the state has no direct interest in these things, at least when the issues that give rise to the possibility of this have been dissolved. The problem with capitalist monopolies is that whatever force has this monopoly always has an interest above any other interest, and that is itself, right? It is true that the state has the capacity. Indeed, we've seen through the history of the 20th century a number of situations, most notably the Soviet Union, in which the state acted in its own interest. It lifted itself up over the interests of its people. And there are a number of reasons for this. Perhaps more than anything else, the state was still operating within a capitalist milieu in many ways. But The counter argument to that, the argument that's made, and it's made in different ways by different kinds of socialists. A Marxist would make it one way, a democratic socialist would make it another way. But the gist of that argument is essentially to say that while it is true that centralized economies sometimes fail, they're not certain to fail the way a monopoly is certain to fail in terms of its production, right? They're not certain to consume themselves because the only interest they have is their own interest. And this becomes one of the things that needs to be remedied from it. Even beyond this, though, even beyond the dysfunction and the contradictions to the wealth that is supposed to be produced within a capitalist society, the socialist will point out that these previous systems, again, capitalism in particular, produce institutions, practices, and even value systems that reinforce the contradictions in the minds and habits of people within the confines of this system. In other words, the way in which these contradictions are maintained is by creating systematically a kind of pathology in the people who depend upon this political economy, in this case, capitalism. What kinds of pathologies are we talking about? Well, there's a number of places that we can look for this, and you've probably heard a few of these phrases before because they've kind of that describe them because they've come into common usage, even though they were originally academic phrases. Perhaps you have heard of the phrase conspicuous consumption, right? Conspicuous consumption is the idea that those who have wealth find ways in which to demonstrate their wealth to other wealthy people, as well as those who do not have wealth, the proletariat, the working class, the hoi polloi, whatever you want to talk about. And they do it by acquiring things not that are useful, but in fact are entirely useless, right? That are luxuries, that cost enormous amounts of capital, which they use not to actually produce anything, but rather to simply reinforce and demonstrate their position in society over and against other people who own the means of production and have wealth. This was an idea that was developed by a man named Thorstein Veblen at the end of the 19th century in a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class. But it speaks to just one of the pathologies that we see here. An even deeper pathology, one that is sort of at the heart of a lot of Marxist socialism and is certainly recognized and lifted up as a problem that needs to be addressed in things like democratic socialism, is the dependency that capitalism has on the exploitation and alienation of labor in order to make that capitalism understands wealth is in terms of storing it privately for individuals to be able to use systematically. Now, in and of itself, that doesn't sound like a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it's often noted out that there are environments where this could actually be a pretty functional or productive kind of thing. But the problem is that particularly when you have an industrialized society or a post-industrial society like we have, a technological society, where wealth has to do with continued acquisition and doesn't have to do with production for the good of society, but control of the means of production and the dividends that come from that, right? Capital gains, as we call them, stocks, bonds, rent collection, things like that. In the economic sense of rent collection, right? Owning something without having to actually do anything with it. You just have the right to get dividends from it. That with those sorts of ideas, you have a rather perverse incentive at work, at least from a socialist point of view, in terms of how you ought to treat labor. Because what you need to do in order to make more money is to get labor to work harder and to remove their right or claims to what they produce with their work from that. In other words, you jack up the price and you tape down the wages, right, or the benefits or anything like this. And this isn't something that happens just, in one fell swoop. It's not something that just happens immediately like that. It's something that happens again and again and again and again and reiterates itself. When you think about how difficult it is in some areas of the economy to hire full-time people because you would have to pay them quote unquote benefits, right? Think about what that means for a minute. You're not willing to pay basic benefits, things that wealth is supposed to be able to do in that society, simply because in order to be productive, in order to justify, and this goes even for public places too, you are required to store that wealth for yourself. This is something that's created by the system. This doesn't have to do with the institutions themselves. This doesn't have to do with the individuals themselves. This has to do with the way in which wealth is thought of, the way in which it acts, the way in which it works through a capitalist system. And the socialist would say, this need not be the case. It doesn't have to be this way. Wealth doesn't have to be thought of in terms of acquisition. It doesn't have to be thought of in terms of zero-sum games. It doesn't have to be thought of in terms of exploitation and alienation. And it doesn't have to be thought of in using people and treating people as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Because that ultimately, the socialist says, is what society and the wealth within society is for, to treat people and indeed treat the entirety of society as an end of itself. And that brings me to the last point that I would want to bring up as far as the socialist ideology, themes within socialist ideology go. And that is that, well, what do we got here, River? We're bringing something up here? Connecting something? Okay, you're going to log in. Well, what I was going to say is that the last thing that this brings up is that these pathologies, in turn, that I've been mentioning here, extend system-wide and end up shaping things outside of the economy itself, beyond the political economy. What am I thinking of here? Well, I would say consider the destruction of the environment. And why? Why do we allow climate change to persist? Why is it that we see it as inevitable, almost like trying to turn a ship before it hits an iceberg, only it's too late? Why is that? Well, because of economic growth. Because we simply can't stop. The fact that we needed to make economic growth, and we make as a sacrifice for that the ecology of the planet we live on, is a demonstration of just how deeply this pathology that I was just mentioning can get. It runs throughout the system, and indeed beyond the system of political economy itself to the environment. Or another example a socialist might bring up. We live in a time where the very notion of privacy is something that is endangered. Perhaps it might be extinct already. The very fact that we're engaged in this Zoom conversation and that we're online means all this data, all this information of everything that we've been looking at, of people that we've been talking to outside, if Siri's been listening, which probably she has, all these sorts of things, this seems to be vanishing. Now, perhaps this is something that's necessary and inevitable. Perhaps privacy is a vestige of an earlier time and we need to do it in order to advance. But why is it being sacrificed? Well, because it allows for expanding markets. It allows for advertising, right? That's what actually justified this stuff in the first place. It wasn't even anything as nefarious as Big Brother listening in so as to control your thoughts. No, it was far more mundane than that. It was so they could find out what kind of jeans you wanted to buy and then start pushing all these little ads to you and making a ton of money off of it. And yet this is being done for the sake of sacrificing these ideas. So these are some of the general themes in the ideology with this. And like I said, I really want to make clear that the scope of how democratic socialisms and authoritarian socialisms and what are sometimes called utopian socialisms how they manifest or would like to manifest with this goes in very different directions. So I'm speaking in broad, generalized terms in order to sort of get them to fit into one tent, so to speak. But I do think that it probably works with this. Now, another question that came up with this when I was talking to Shannon and Mary Jane about Sarah Jane about what you'd like me to talk about. One of the issues that I gathered was, what's the connection between socialism and liberalism? It's a very good question. It's an interesting question, because there is a certain way in which, certainly if you listen to the political insults that are leveled from the right these days, one of the things that you'll hear is sort of those liberal socialist so-and-sos, the radical leftists want to do this and that and the other thing. And you would get the impression, if you didn't know anything about this, that liberalism and socialism are both one and the same thing. They seem to be joined at the hip. This isn't really true at all. There's a way that certainly socialism shares a number of qualities with liberalism. It's a fellow traveler, so to speak, or they are fellow travelers in a number of areas. But there's also a number of ways in which socialism and liberalism are distinct from one another. And it's worth pointing out what these things are. And before I go into that, let me make sure I'm clear about what the term liberal means here, because the term liberal is probably almost as vague as the term socialist, but it's ambiguous. It has as many different applications as that. But I would say this: if I were to give a very generalized view of what liberalism refers to, it refers to systems or institutions, or for that matter, values that lift up liberty, both its virtues and its possibilities. Now, in saying that, that sounds, I suppose, kind of straightforward, but there's something that you should keep in mind with it that comes into play here. It's something I find I often have to remind my own students of in classes, and that is that the term liberal can be politically leftist, but it can also be politically rightist too. That is to say, you can have liberals who are leftists in the sense that they're liberal progressives. Quite often they share a lot of the same territory with democratic socialists, such as yourselves. But you can also have liberals who are rightists. Many forms of libertarianism they're liberal in the sense that they lift up liberty, but they are definitely right-wing in that they look towards order that protects, in particular, the property and private property in private markets, and don't do anything. Indeed, they discourage moving things towards equality, equanimity, rectification, anything else like this. So you can have liberals who are right-wing too. I think the Koch brothers would probably be a good example of that. Or the one remaining Koch brother, I guess the other one died. So they have socialism, keeping that in mind, that there's a lot of meaning to liberalism, just like there's a lot of meaning to socialism. I would say that if we look at what socialism and liberalism have in common, we can see that, well, they both, for whatever different directions that they would go, they would both recognize that there are social and political and economic forces that are outside of individuals, that fundamentally limit the freedom of individuals, and that it is the duty of government to remedy these forces and their negative impacts. Now, sometimes, in the case of right-wing liberalism, that has to do with removing public regulations on things. I mean, I try to subscribe to a wide array of political sites and newsletters and things like that in different ways, just to sort of keep my hand on what's being talked about and how things are being worked. And there's one that I have, that's one of the more right-wing ones that I get, and it's called Liberty Dispatch News, What's Affecting Your Liberty Today? It's very, very liberal with that regard. But every single thing that they bring up has to do with the idea that government is interfering with your liberty. And the only way to protect liberty, that is the only way to protect this force that is limiting your freedom, is by removing regulations. Well, this is something that would, except for the fact that it's recognizing the general principle that there are things outside of you, it's totally different from socialism, right? But they do recognize this, that there are forces outside of us that shape the world around us, and that government's duty is to try to protect how those forces impact individuals. But that being said, there's probably more stronger differences between liberalism and socialism than there are similarities with this regard. First of all, the freedom of the individual cannot be allowed to affect society from a socialist point of view, whereas it can and indeed needs to be protected from the liberal point of view. And this really goes in different directions. From a more moderate democratic socialist point of view, you limit what individuals can do with regard to things like pollution, with regard to things like economy, monopoly, wealth acquisition, things like that. When you get to more extreme versions of this, when you get towards Marxism, you are beginning to talk about things that become authoritarian, things like controlling communication and even what political positions are allowed to be held at all. So you can go into extremes with this stuff. But there's an awareness that you can't simply let people do whatever they want. You can't lift up liberty above the good of society as a whole. Whereas liberalism says even unpopular ideas are extremely important. Indeed, quite often it is those unpopular ideas which help us correct our course and see things that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. We would still have slavery if it weren't for liberal attitudes with regard to slavery and the protests, even though it was something that was accepted and legal and in huge swaths of this country and was gaining a certain amount of legal currency in the 40s and 50s, 1840s and 1850s. The other thing, I guess, that I would say is a distinction between socialism and liberalism is the distinction between what marks progress. Liberalism tends to mark progress in terms of growth, the acquisition of more, the ability to do more, the idea that you would go through and make more things. Socialism, on the other hand, while it certainly has an awareness of growth, isn't going to lift up growth for its own sake. Rather, it's going to look at flourishing. It's going to look at ways in which members of the society, the wealth through society, is being able to be taken care of and distributed through the society for the greater good. And this, I guess, gets me to the last point that I would want to bring up with this, the aims and visions of socialism overall. Despite the wide array of ways in which socialism can move and go, socialism, it can have a revolutionary dimension, the way you have with Marxism, the idea that socialism is really just a step in the evolution, the often violent evolution towards the fundamental state of society, namely communism, the end of property in its entirety. Or you can have the more moderate versions of things like democratic socialism, where there's a way in which these, we were talking about before, that these ills of society, the inequities of society, the exploitation of society are meted down by the centralization of these basic needs and then the distribution throughout the society as a whole. But with all of them, there is this idea in socialism of transforming society. And this is an important point. That society and the ills of society are things that don't have to be this way from a socialist point of view. Society can be transformed. It can be transformed to be more equitable. It can be transformed to be more just. It can be transformed to be more inclusive of all members and all of regardless of who they are, where they're from, what they believe, how they identify, and so on and so forth. And it can be organized towards a more communitarian, or to be organized with solidarity, so that the power of society with all of its different parts can act as one, in unison, as a solid force to realize and meet the ends that it needs to meet. Because by doing that, we can, from the socialist point of view, whether radically or in small gradual steps, move towards the society that we would hope to become without needing this process of exploitation, alienation, and zero-sum games notions of productions of wealth. All right. I tried to put all of that into a little tiny capsule for you. That's my spiel. I wanted to leave a little bit of time here for questions or thoughts. What do you guys got here? Let's see. Is there a component of cultural responsiveness in any form of socialism? Has this been explored in American politics? Cultural responsiveness. Well, it kind of depends on what do you mean by cultural responsiveness exactly? I'm inclined to say yes, but I want to know what you mean exactly, Marcia. Maybe you could speak. It's okay if you want to speak.
Sure. Sorry, I was finding the unmute. Just that, you know, I work in equity and education. And
yeah, sure.
Big component of, you know, and even research into the brain of how cultural responsiveness helps us to learn and helps us reach our potential. So it just seems that our economic systems would need to match a person's culture. You know, how do they address communities of color in socialism? I'm just trying to learn. Right. I know I'm okay with a socialist, but, you know, just trying to connect the dots here.
Sure, I see where you're coming from. Well, I guess I would say this. For the most part, given that socialism moves towards inclusiveness, right, that it moves towards trying to bring all dimensions of society into it with the idea of organizing around it, it would I think the idea of cultural responsiveness and the idea of reaching out to where people are with the values that they have and finding ways to incorporate it into the larger body politic, the larger political economy, and to do so equitably is very much at the heart of socialism with regard to that. So in that regard, I'd say I know, you know, some of the work that you do, and I would say what you do and what democratic socialism in particular would do is very much on point with that. The one thing that I would say, though, is in sort of distinction of this, is that oftentimes that part of what cultural responsiveness has to do with is the incorporation of identity politics, and that I am this, I'm from this place, we are this people. And identity politics tends to be dampened within socialist movements. Either sort of moderately dampened, not even all that moderately in democratic socialism, but somewhat, to being outright suppressed in the more authoritarian and radical forms of socialism. And the reason is pretty clear. It's because identity politics creates the seeds for disunion, for disruption within solidarity. It undermines a lot of the aims of this. When you look at something like Marxism, one of the things that, and granted, Marxism is only one branch of socialism, and it's quite far to the left, but it is a very prominent and important part of this. One of the things Marxism will go so far as to say is that identity politics is something that exists and is used by the owners of the means of production to use people who do not own things against one another. Marx would he points out, why is it that, and given that Marx is living in the 19th century, he says, why is it in the American South that poor white people and slaves do not make common cause? And the answer, he says, is a very, very, very intense effort on the part of the owners of the bean production, in this case, the plantation owning class, to stir up and create identity politics. Create identity politics so that each sees the other as an enemy that where they're fighting for scraps, while the system and reality and just the way it is makes it where wealth accumulates at the top with these classes. And that's just one example that Marx gives. He gives all sorts of other stuff. I use that one because it's probably a little more familiar to us than his European examples. But it's
yeah. I appreciate the example. I just feel like the danger, to me, the warning signs were that this has the danger of becoming a dominant culture that tells people they have to subscribe to a certain way, which has what our communities of color have been hearing since.
Well, sure. I mean, solidarity yeah. has the potential to catalyze homogeneity, I guess you'd say. And to do that, to see that as a very basic, it's not doing it to lift up white supremacy or anything like that. It's a more of a homogeneity because it's an economic homogeneity.
Right.
But
I worry that it would erase it could erase identity. And so I just would be careful of that.
That's
fully on board with like public ownership and all the, just to be careful and make sure that those leaders are aware.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah. No, what you're saying, Marcia, is essentially one of the concerns that a leftist, liberal, progressive would say against socialism, right? Or as a concern about socialism. That's sort of what I was getting at with it. So, and then the socialist response. Other questions or thoughts or anything? The socialist Finns in Uniontown. Well, I know a little about them. I mean, if you ever really want to know about them, the guy to talk to about that is John Gutenberger. That guy knows everything about everything in Astoria, and he is amazing. I mean, I would highly encourage it. But I can tell you this. I can tell you that the socialist Finns in Uniontown back in the day, and the day being the 20s and 30s in particular, were true socialists. They were there were several sort of allied groups, but the main group was a group called the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, and it was a union, but the IWW was these were truly. They weren't just socialists; they were communists. They were people who were they were a union that aimed at changing the very nature of what ownership and labor was meant to do, and they were willing to do it radically. They were allied with Bolsheviks, and they were radical. And I just love telling students about this is that so they're over in Uniontown, and while that's going on in Uniontown, on the other side of town, in Upper Town and Alderbrook and stuff like that, you had a concentration of white supremacists, including the Ku Klux Klan. And it was because this was during the sort of the second period of the Ku Klux Klan's rising, where it was a kind of an organization that expanded not just from the South, but really throughout the country as an avenue of conservative politics. And you would have in the 1920s out on like Exchange Street, the Finns, the wobbly Finns coming down from the west side of town, and you would have the Ku Klux Klan coming from the east side of town, and they would get in fist fights like the Sharks and the Jets. That's why I love Astoria right there. The fact that we have things like that is just, I mean, it would have been terrifying at the time, but 100 years out, it's great. So. Yeah, so there you go. I can tell you that, and I hope that Heather, that you talk to John Gutenberger, because the dude he is such a store of wealth with these things. The urban-rural divide in the U.S. a lot recently. I'm curious what some of the hot-button issues are that come up with these two different groups when talking about socialism. Well, it's it's interesting, Leif, with this, that socialism is, if this is something where actually if people are interested in this, you might not believe it from everything I laid on you, but I actually edited quite a bit out, and in particular, I edited a lot of history out. And if you're ever interested, I can give you a talk about some of the history of socialism in the United States, because socialism was something that at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century was being worked within, and really especially in the progressive era in the early 20th century, was something that was being worked through a number of rural areas, particularly in the Midwest and particularly in the Northwest. That's how the Wobblies were able to be associated with the timber falling groups here in Astoria. That there was, there is a reason why the universal symbols of socialism are the hammer, which is industry, and the sickle, which is agriculture, right? These two things coming together. It's one and the other. I think one of the things that's happened recently is that and I think it's happened for a lot of different reasons that social scientists are still trying to study, but there has been a tremendous alienation from labor movements and social movements in the rural United States for several decades. Really, I'd say since probably about the 1950s. I think some of it has to do with the demise and redistribution of labor unions. I think it has to do with sadly, some of the reactions that have happened with regard to the civil rights movement, and I think it has to do with again this aspect of people being wrapped up and sort of contained within political life in the way that they have, where they don't realize that they are actually participating in the structures that put them in a beholden and exploited situation. I mean, Marx has a term for this. It's one I didn't bring up too much because it doesn't get used by democratic socialism all that much. It's more radical, but it's a very important term, and it's called false consciousness. It's a very important idea within these that people actually come to, and Marcia, this kind of comes a little back to what you were asking before too, that there is a way that people can sometimes come to accept and identify with positions and identities that actually economically work against their interests, but they will fight tooth and nail because it is theirs and it is them and that is what they want. And the structure of the system depends upon that. Right, that they create a situation where they will accept and aid in their own exploitation and do it in the name of being of their own freedom. This is a point that Marx brings up a lot, and he spends a lot of time talking about in all sorts of things, not even just. He doesn't really talk about it all that much in the. I guess a little in the Communist Manifesto, but in other later works especially. So, all right.
I just wanted to mention real quick that the Wobblies are still going and unionized a bunch of Burgervilles in Portland, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they are. That's right. I actually had a student write a paper on that just last year, a couple of years ago, about the Wobblies unionizing in Burgerville and sort of the story with that. Yeah, they absolutely do exist. They were they're nothing like they were in their heyday in the 20s and 30s. I mean, they were a real force to be reckoned with in terms of national politics at that point. Now they're I think one of the things that was sort of their strength at that time has become a little bit of their weakness, which is that they're so dispersed and dissolved that it's hard it's hard for that aspect of organized labor to get organized. That said, in certain environments and circumstances, like for instance, Portland, Oregon, it is possible to organize, and that is what they've done. They're still in the middle of a lot of the struggles around that. It's hardly a done deal, but it's a real good point to bring up, Luca. So, I like that there is evolution of concepts and not think that we're ready for a post-racial, post-identity society, but that's what we should work towards. Yeah, it is. And I think this is another thing to bring up too, Marcia, with this, that there's very much a way within, especially within Marxism. Marxist thought really puts its definition on this, but really throughout other forms of socialism too, that we have to remember that these systems that we observe, with the inequities that they have and the injustices that they have, the contradictions that they have, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in history. They come from somewhere and from some set of circumstances, and they move towards places. Indeed, part of what makes evolution possible, and depending on who you talk to, revolution inevitable, is the fact that these are always moving, right? That this is always happening. So that we're on a moving train. And as Howard Zinn wrote in one of his last books, you can't stand still on a moving train, right? We're always in a state where things are changing and moving and shifting. So this is it. Well, looks like we're just about ready to wrap up, I guess. I thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to hearing from you guys all. And by the way, if you ever want to take a philosophy class or a religion class or a politics class up at the college, please do. I'm teaching them all the time, and I'd love to have you guys in there, even just for an audit. It'd be great to have you. Okay? All right. I'll see you guys later. Thank you again for coming.
And I'd just like to say real quick that if anyone wants to get involved with our local DSA, you can join through dsausa.org and then get connected to us through our Facebook or Instagram, and definitely like to work with you. Thank you. And thank you, Seth. That was an amazing lecture.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. All right. Well, I'll see you guys around town, and maybe I'll see you in class or at a public talk sometime. So